a spooky series of chillingly curated tales, written and narrated by short, scary horror stories.
Dan had held the letter in his hand for most of the evening, deeply hesitant to open it for fear of what those words could conceive. Deep down, though, the whole of him knew, without the slightest slither of doubt, the overbearing significance of its sender. Gazing upon the unopened letter again, Dan felt convinced he could decipher the distinct handwriting style adorning the envelope. What struck him most, however, were the signature strokes and the intimate way in which those letters interlinked. These subtle nuances, coupled with the recognizable nature of the various slants, slopes, and personalized expressionisms, had all seemed far too familiar to be chalked up solely to chance. In Dan's mind, it formed, without even the slightest inkling of uncertainty, a particular cursive style of written form that only his late mother could produce. But in reality, how could this be? Besides, Dan's mother had passed away precisely a year ago today. Was it then, by some sheer serendipitous event or simple coincidence, that he would hear from her once more on the tragic anniversary of her untimely death? Stranger still, the prior but no less peculiar events of how Dan had come into possession of such a letter just so happens to evoke a familiar feeling of fearful fascination. Earlier that evening, Dan was basking in the warm, radiant glow of a roaring fire, indulging in a regular evening tipple, when his eyes suddenly drifted toward the bookshelf occupying the northeasternmost corner of the living room. Corralled under the potent spell of some bizarre affliction, like a helpless moth drawn to incandescence, as if succumbing to hypnosis, Dan had become wholly mesmerized by his mother's favorite novel and its strangely alluring aura, which seemed to only intensify with each second that passed. Suddenly overcome by a fierce inner compulsion, he could no longer compose his senses. Yet, miraculously, Dan had somehow managed to stagger to the room's far side while consumed by this most curious psychosis merely moments later. Even while fully immersed in a sleepily sedated state, Dan had still found himself, somewhat fatefully, in possession of the book, flicking feverishly in a delirious daze through the first few chapters. Trapped in a lucid trance amidst the ensuing hysteria, by that point, Dan's pupils had rolled toward the back of his head, which, in a terrifying escalation of events, inexplicably revealed with almost ghostly symbolism the bloodshot whites of his eyes. In some curious twist of fate, shortly after, the envelope had violently spat out from the book onto the floor below, as if willfully summoned by some ethereal force. But before calmness reclaimed the room, Dan would experience yet another deeply unsettling event when, out of nowhere, a feral burst of violent energy crashed through the lounge window. Seemingly of its own volition, the destructive force had unleashed in its wake a foul, howling, and ferocious gust that strangled and smothered Dan's skin. His crimson blood chilled cold to the core. And, in the madness of it all, Dan had lay there collapsed and starved of air for what felt like an eternity. The chilling event lasted just seconds overall, yet unbeknownst to Dan, it had somehow summoned something darkly sinister inside his home. When Dan finally came to his senses not long after regaining full consciousness, however, as if by the hand of some elusive sorcery, everything had returned to relative calm. Despite feeling deeply perturbed by the day's events, Dan decided to open the envelope. Besides, he'd come too far to turn back now. Summoning the courage after a prolonged swig of whiskey, he removed the letter slowly, his hands visibly trembling with suspense during every inch of the retrieve. Unfolding the letter with lingering apprehension, Dan read through the first few lines.
To my dear Dan, whom I love so fondly.
The letter stated,
If you are reading this, then I'm long past from our material plane, and your deductive powers are as exceptional today as they were as a young, precocious mind. Somehow, I knew you'd discover this letter, my love.
Dan could barely believe it. At that moment, his lips trembled through sheer disbelief, his breath becoming louder and heavier with each muttered word.
There's something I should tell you.
Dan read aloud, quivering with frightful curiosity.
You probably wondered why strange things happened in this house during our time together. It's something that I've kept hidden from you for far too long, for your safety. But now I feel it's time. It's time I told you the truth.
Dan gasped with a sense of startled astonishment. Tonight, I will confront this ethereal force once and for all, even if it kills me, he told himself, slamming his fist on the manteltop in fearful frustration. Glugging down a second glass of bourbon, Dan continued reading the letter.
Do you remember that old painting we used to have hanging in the upstairs hallway? The peculiar one with the veiled woman? Well, ever since the day we purchased that portrait at an antique auction, a series of strangely despicable instances started taking place, the likes of which still haunt my soul and the halls of that house today. Son, whatever you do, promise me you'll destroy that portrait should any strange occurrences escalate beyond your control. The picture's cursed, dear, I'm telling you. It's locked away in the basement. The key to it I've hidden beneath a loose tile on the kitchen floor. You'll know when you see it. My love, it's time to banish that wretched curse forever. I believe in you. Good luck, my love. Always in my heart, your dearest mother.
Swiping the tears from his coldly pale complexion, Dan inhaled a deep conscious breath. Resembling the stark realization of his newfound fate and the grim admittance of a dreaded oncoming confrontation, in equal measure, he suddenly felt a foreboding sense of fate consume his whole being. Having retrieved the key, Dan quickly made his way toward the basement, but as he approached the adjoining hallway with cautious trepidation, a ghostly silhouette miraculously presented itself from the shadows. At that moment, the chandeliers above began to sway violently back and forth. Gazing down the hall at the long-haired shadowy specter, Dan looked on in sheer horror as the ghostly face before him flickered between opposing expressions. As if caught in an endless loop, the mouth shifted sinisterly from a frown to a smile, while disturbingly juxtaposed, the gaunt cheeks rose and sunk in jarring disharmony. Per every frightening transition, the facial skin became tighter and grossly distorted, following the bone-chilling reveal of each unsettling smirk as the eerie entity hovered ever closer. Suddenly, the strange figure disappeared into thin air, leaving a curious cloud of murky vapor in its wake. Then, a loud, screeching cackle echoed across the hallway, and the swinging chandeliers crashed furiously to the floor as the profoundly ethereal mist vanished beneath the basement door. Panic-stricken, Dan reluctantly removed the padlock. As sweat poured profusely from his skin, he timidly pushed the door ajar and proceeded down the basement stairs. Frantically reaching for the light switch, Dan could feel a luminous white presence lurking in the corner of his eye, with insidious intent. But as light flooded through the basement, he noticed, to his immense terror, the portrait lying flat on the cold concrete floor. Only this time, the woman typically present in the picture was nowhere to be seen. Then, like some paranormal portal between worlds, the unsightly mask miraculously manifested inside the frame, as if traversing material planes, where it assumed a sickeningly sinister smile upon its ghostly return, as the basement lights plunged into absolute darkness.
You're mine now.
The voice cried, as Dan was helplessly dragged into the picture.
Don't forget to subscribe for more spooky tales, written and narrated by short, scary horror stories.